one of the core assumptions of economic liberalism is that trade is efficient. And that trade is positive sum. And whenever I make that observation, I usually sort of, wave my hand and say, oh, that's what the economists tell us. I'd like to explain why the economists think that, and particularly to talk about David Ricardo's concept of comparative advantage. And so part of the idea of comparative advantage is that we're trying to minimize the opportunity costs collectively that everybody is sort of facing. Opportunity cost being sort of the value of the unselected option, right? I have a limited amount of time. When I choose to do one thing, that means I don't have the time to do something else. There are those kind of trade-offs, and ideally, I'm allocating my time at things that are, very worthwhile compared to alternatives, but that's not always the case. And so the idea of comparative advantage is that we can make choices about how to produce goods that take into consideration that some countries are better at producing goods, that they have advantages due to climate and geography and technology. But really, we shouldn't be thinking about who's best at things. We should be thinking about how to allocate time collectively in the best possible way. That seems abstract. Let me give a general example and then a very specific example that Ricardo talks about. So the general example I'll give you is related to myself, Brian Urlacher, the college professor, and what I do with my summer. And generally, I have summers off. And then Brian Urlacher, the former Chicago Bears football player, who I guess is now retired and presumably also has summers off. And the question we might ask is, should Brian Urlacher, the football player, mow his own lawn? Or should he hire me, Brian Urlacher, the college professor, to mow his lawn? And if we were just thinking about the question of, who is better at mowing lawns, it's almost certainly Brian Urlacher, the football player, right? He's a big guy. Presumably, he's got a big yard. There's a push lawnmower. Pushing things is like what he's good at, right? He was a defensive lineman, and pushing is a core feature of the job. He's in shape. Presumably, he could mow his lawn very efficiently. I, however, am fairly small. I'm not in great shape. I would have to stop for lemonade breaks frequently. I would be a terrible lawnmower. And yet, Ricardo would say, don't think about who is better at mowing the lawn. Think about what you're giving up. And so Brian Urlacher, the football player, has all sorts of important things he can do. He can go to charity events. He can make chunky soup commercials. He can, do all sorts of things that are going to bring joy and prosperity to the world. And so every hour he spends mowing his lawn is taking him away from those other kinds of activities. Whereas my opportunity cost, what I give up when I'm mowing a lawn, is, I guess, writing another paper that only a handful of people are going to read. And so Ricardo might say, yeah, your opportunity cost is much smaller than Brian Urlacher, the football player. He's making a huge sacrifice when he mows his lawn. It would be better for you, Brian Urlacher, the college professor, to mow his lawn for him so that he can do those other things, freeing him up, minimizing the overall opportunity cost. And that's kind of the idea of comparative advantage in a general sense, but we should talk it through in terms of the actual numbers in the example that Ricardo offers us. And so in his scenario, he has two countries, Portugal and England, and two goods that countries can produce, wine and cloth. And it takes 8 people in Portugal to produce $100 worth of wine. It takes 9 people to produce $100 worth of cloth. England is actually worse at making wine and cloth compared to Portugal. Apparently, the English countryside is not conducive to growing grapes, and so it takes 11 people in England to make $100 worth of wine. And I guess maybe the hills aren't as conducive for sheep. I'm not sure. So it takes 10 people to produce $100 worth of cloth. And so if we were to just simply think about a world in which there was no trade happening and countries had to produce wine and cloth for themselves, and if Portugal decided that half of its population would be dedicated to making wine and half would be dedicated to making cloth, then for every 10 people in Portugal, you're going to get $62.50 worth of wine, because I guess you're able to allocate 5 people out of every 10 to wine production, and I guess 5/8 of 100 would be 62.50. and you're going to get $55.50 worth of cloth because it takes 9 people to make $100 worth of cloth, but you're only able to allocate 5 out of every 10 people. And so for every 10 people you have producing wine and cloth in Portugal, you're going to get $118 worth of stuff. England, however, being worse at producing wine and cloth, is only going to get $95.40 out of every 10 people that it allocates to these tasks, assuming 5 go to wine and 5 go to cloth. They'll get $50 worth of wine, or of cloth, I should say, because it takes 10 people to make $100 worth. They're allocating 5, that's their $50. But they're only getting $45.40 worth of wine. They're only allocating 5 people. It takes 11. They're getting 95.40. Collectively, you're getting $213.40 worth of stuff, right? So that's the scenario that exists when there's no trade going on and countries are trying to produce both wine and cloth on their own. But then Ricardo says, well, what happens if Portugal were to specialize in wine production? Not because England is particularly good at making cloth. England is terrible at making cloth. It's just that Portugal is way better at making wine than England. And so if they're specializing in wine production, they're going to produce $125 worth for every 10 people that they allocate. If England is focused on producing cloth, they're going to produce $100 worth, and that's going to mean that collectively they're producing $225 worth of these goods, whereas before they were producing, less than that. Portugal's increased its output for every 10 people by $7. England has increased its output for every 10 workers by $5.60. And again, there's now more wine and cloth to be shared out between Portugal and England. In fact, there's 5.6 more, right? We haven't changed anything in terms of technology or in terms of finding efficiencies. All we've done is say that if Portugal is able to focus its energy on producing wine, something it's really good at compared to everybody else, just like Brian Urlacher, the football player, focusing on chunky soup commercials, that's going to generate way more value. And if we can free Portugal up to do that by having somebody else do things that maybe they're not as good at, but free Portugal up to use their population for wine production, we're going to collectively see greater returns and better outcomes. And there's, I think, a really important takeaway from this. There's lots of arguments that get put out about why markets are really important for efficiency, right? The competition and the invisible hand sort of puts pressure on businesses to innovate or to adopt new technologies. Adam Smith talks about the idea of the scope of the market, that the more inputs you have in terms of supply and demand signals coming in, the more efficiently you're able to allocate resources. And so he notes that large economies tend to do better than small economies, and so maybe trade is efficient because it's giving you access to greater scope of the market. But what Ricardo is observing is that you don't actually need markets to make trade efficient. Trade is efficient in the absence of markets, right? This scenario that he sketched out, somebody's sort of dictating what every 10 people are going to do, and found a way to get greater outputs from this. And so I think an interesting illustration of this is that during the 20th century, countries that had command economies like the Soviet Union or China or even India, where it was very a top-down kind of economy, and certainly Eastern Europe and Cuba, set up trade agreements amongst themselves, not because they were looking for market efficiency, but because they recognized that certain countries could produce other things really well, and that it didn't make sense for everybody to try to produce everything on their own, rather than freeing up countries to produce what they were really good at, even if others produced things that were less great, made for greater efficiency. And so there were trade agreements that were set up that would exchange quantities of goods to realize these efficiencies. And I think that's an interesting observation, that efficiencies from trade come not just from magnifying competition, but by helping countries to narrow in and find how to allocate our collective resources in a way that minimizes opportunity costs to get collectively the best outcome possible, given the available resources and inputs that we have to offer.